welcome to Politics in the Park. Last week we had a very august audience concerned with the Russell Tribunal, and the audience tonight is confronted with an equally important topic, the deregulation of universities, the perpetuation of inequality in Australia. Dr. Nick Riemer over there is a senior lecturer in English at the University of Sydney and part-time in the Department of Linguistics. Nick is a very important university citizen, not just in Sydney University. He's one of the founder members of a National Union for Public Universities. He's a key member of the National Teachers Educational Union on campus for universities. And as important in the long term, he's a key player in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, struggling to achieve self-determination for the people of Palestine.
Thanks a lot, Stuart, and thanks everybody for asking me here tonight. In 1998, the World Bank issued its report called Higher Education Relevance in the 21st Century, a document which reads like a blueprint for the subsequent development of Australian universities. In order to operate efficiently, it said, universities will need to be much reduced in size. They'll comprise a small core of faculty and a much larger periphery of experts of various kinds that are linked to universities in various ways. Perhaps their role will be limited to accrediting teaching done primarily by others, while in research playing their part by orchestrating problem-solving teams to work on fundamental issues. So relevance, efficiency, size reduction, problem-solving teams. We can recognise here the all too familiar neoliberal code for the corporatisation and marketisation of higher education, a vision where universities are downsized into training and R&D hubs reliant on a massively casualised workforce, with teaching and research placed almost entirely at the beck and call of the market. Pretty much, in other words, exactly the kind of conception of universities that drives the government, industry and most vice-chancellors today. And the current debate on deregulation in higher education has to be seen in this context, I think. Deregulation isn't a one-off policy response to a punctual problem. It's the latest move in the systematic and decades-long disengagement of governments from higher education funding, on a par with similar attempts at disengagement from healthcare, welfare benefits and other socially progressive aspects of the infrastructure of the modern welfare state. And of course, it goes without saying that Australia is no exception to this trend. Public funding here dropped by an average of $4,000 between 1994 and 2002, and we now sit only one rung from the bottom of OECD countries when it comes to investment in higher education. US state funding for public universities, similar story, fell from 76% in 1988 to 52% in 2013. In the UK, public universities were 80% funded as recently as 1995, but only 25% publicly funded in 2010. So deregulation is part of a global disinvestment from higher education, in which Australia has been a very enthusiastic participant. But it also needs to be seen in the context of what's afoot elsewhere in the Australian economy at the moment. Now, tomorrow happens to be the due date for submissions to the Productivity Commission's review of a range of labour relations issues, including the minimum wage, penalty rates, bargaining, and employee protections like unfair dismissal laws. And this will clearly muster arguments for future attacks on wage earners carried out in the name of flexibility, competition, and employment. Now, nothing from this program is ready to be legislated yet, of course, but it's pretty clear what kinds of reform the government would like to institute if it could get away with it. Like university deregulation, the ongoing rationalisation of the economy represents a further step away from policy predicated on the importance of things like safety nets, redistribution, and the importance or the role of the state in creating some sort of level playing field between labour and capital. And as such, it will fall hardest on exactly the same people that university deregulation will disadvantage the most, namely, on the one hand, women, and on the other hand, young people. So if the government gets away if it gets its way, rather, on penalty rates as well as on deregulation, and Richard has already touched on this, young people won't just find themselves leaving university with high debt, they'll also earn less for the weekend work that's presently their most lucrative form of employment and the one that least interferes with their studies. And it's not hard to see this, I think, as a particularly savage kind of attack or a savage kind of intergenerational theft, a fact that has been particularly highlighted, I think, by the National Alliance for Public Universities, a great new organisation of which I'm a proud member and of which I have a couple of colleagues are here tonight. So since the deregulation proposal emerged last May, there's been a flood of detailed and authoritative analyses demonstrating its regressive consequences. There's now an amended version of the legislation waiting to come before the Senate, and a welter of different proposals from various quarters about what to do about our university funding mess. And I'm not going to summarise any of that here. Instead, I'll briefly highlight a few important things. And the first is that the foundation of opposition to deregulation, in my opinion, has to be the principle that higher education is first and foremost a public good and not a private one, which is what government and VCs all want to claim. Any version of deregulation, whether it's the government's original bill or the amended one waiting to go before the Senate, shifts responsibility for the funding of this public good away from the state and onto graduates themselves, even though those very graduates will be enriching the community as teachers, accountants, nurses, urban planners, engineers, doctors, or any of the other professions that are indispensable to the proper running of our society and that underwrite the prosperity and well-being of any nation as a whole. Education, simply put, benefits everyone, and it should be funded by a progressive tax system so that those who can best afford it contribute the most. And the fact that we have to argue for this principle starkly highlights, I think, the inroads that economic rationalism has made into Australian life. Now, Vice-Chancellors have assured us that degree costs won't skyrocket under deregulation, as everyone fears they will. That claim might be a bit more credible if Vice-Chancellors weren't simultaneously refusing to make the details of their fee projections public. Last night on the 7:30 report, the Sydney VC that Richard has already flatteringly referred to, Michael Spence, mooted charging $15,000 to $16,000 per annum across all undergraduate degrees. That'd represent more than double the existing cost of an arts, education, nursing or psychology degree. It'd be almost double the cost of a maths or engineering degree as it is at the moment, and it would be a 33% rise for the law, medicine, economics and commerce graduates that would come out under the new system. Spencer's previous comments, along with comments from other VCs, suggest that the scholarships that universities would be able to offer as a result of these fee rises would only be modest, a circumstance that therefore does absolutely nothing to address the fundamental inequity of deregulation as a policy. But let's just suspend all reasonable disbelief and imagine for a moment that fees might only rise modestly in a place like Sydney University if deregulation went through. Even in that unlikely situation, the key consideration against deregulation remains. The absence of constraints on degree costs will simply provide a licence for the further withdrawal of public funds in the future, exactly as has happened already overseas. So the question that we need to ask about this isn't what will universities be charging in 2017 if deregulation goes ahead, but what will they be charging in 2027 if it goes ahead, and if governments use it as the excuse to reduce their state funding even more. So I've suggested, I think, that deregulation should mainly be opposed on the grounds of its socially regressive character. It'll stratify the university sector with high-cost, medium-quality universities like my own Sydney at the top of the chart and low-cost, subprime degree factories at the bottom, with socio-economic background largely determining what kind of institution a student graduates from. But the fight against deregulation needn't limit itself, I don't think, to those equity concerns. even on the government's own narrowly economic grounds, the case for the private benefit of education can be exposed as itself entirely confected. So, a Fairfax analysis based on OECD taxation figures from last year shows that the public rate of return from Australian graduates is twice that of return to the individual. So there's simply no basis for the government's argument that graduates benefit more in dollar terms from going to university than society does. That's not a uniquely Australian circumstance either. There's a 2003 French study which equally brings no evidential support at all to this claim that even in dollar terms or cash terms, the individual benefits more than the public. And when we add to this recent modelling showing that deregulation is likely to drive up the deficit, we're left with the inevitable conclusion that the economic case for deregulation is just as flimsy as the equity one. Furthermore, the overt rationale for the government's higher education reforms is rapidly disappearing. Writing in The Advocate, the publication of the National Tertiary Education Union, of which I'm also a proud member, the NTU's Policy and Research Coordinator notes that even if he acceded even partially to University Australia's demands for modifications to the amended legislation, Pine could no longer sustain the rationale, and I'm quoting, that these policies are for the higher education sector and university students to make their contribution to repairing the budget, because the budget savings just wouldn't be high enough. So the deregulation emperor has no economic clothes. The evils of deregulation aren't confined, I don't think, to its most obvious economic inequities. The more you make students pay to study, the more you limit their opportunities for intellectual and critical growth. Students who simply can't afford to fail a university subject will be less inclined to engage critically with it or to challenge it. And that's not a healthy prescription, I don't think, for a society that values criticism, scepticism, and dissent. You know, this isn't just a concern that is limited to the notional and idealistic world of the humanities. We want doctors who graduate with the habit of challenging pharmaceutical companies' advertising. We want teachers who question the curriculum continually. We want lawyers sceptical of the legal codes they interpret. Deregulation obviously won't sweep any of that away overnight, but I'd suggest that the marketised culture of education that it will foster will militate against it. And of course, I don't exclude myself and people and academics like me from those kinds of effects. There will be equivalent effects on academics and other university staff whose research and teaching will be even more closely tied to economic outcomes and who inevitably risk transforming themselves into what Henry Giroux has memorably called gated intellectuals. So what I'm describing as the undesirable disciplinary effects of deregulation on students is sometimes spun the other way. It's often claimed, for instance, that increasing students' financial exposure or debt for their degree is a way of increasing the responsibility or seriousness with which they approach study. That's an argument against free public education, which can also be applied very readily for deregulation. Now, leaving aside the sort of authoritarian and patronising sentiment behind that, according to which academics like me are somehow supposed to be in a position to lecture students about responsibility, we can point to some interesting French evidence that suggests that there's simply no correlation between tuition fees and a more serious attitude on the parts of students. And the French evidence is this: French tertiary classes préparatoires, which have no fees, are characterised by an intensely studious, probably over-studious student culture, whereas the business schools, which do have fees, are much laxer, much laxer, apparently. So deregulation is a big, from the point of view of the principles animating it and from the point of view of the equity considerations with which it's justified, it's completely incoherent. And that leaves us with the question of the ultimate rationale for the Coalition's deregulation policy. The question of why the ALP is opposed to it, And also, and most interestingly perhaps, the question of why Vice-Chancellors, and especially Group of 8 Vice-Chancellors, are supporting it so doggedly. And I'll end on this in about 5 minutes. I think that's the amount of time I've got left. So the natural interpretation of what we have happening in politics at the moment is, I think, the ideological one. On this view, what we've got is an ideologically coherent neoliberal program aimed at entrenching privilege and disciplining labour, including by placing obstacles in the way of young people's participation in genuine higher education before they enter the workforce, as opposed, of course, to the more elementary kinds of skills training which are essential for business and which will presumably be maintained under any new regime. Now, in my view, that's only part of the truth, because ideological goals are only important insofar as they advance the interests of their proponents within the internal competitive logic of political parties. So let's take Christopher Pyne as an example, much as I find that deeply distasteful. So Pyne is a career politician. He's deeply immersed in the Liberal Party, he's highly ambitious, and he's also someone who was excluded from high office for the entirety of the Howard government. What matters for Pyne, I think, isn't whether his deregulation proposal actually fulfills policy objectives like reducing the deficit. That's why he's prepared to considerably sacrifice those very goals, and why he's quite prepared, as Richard pointed out, to re-regulate what is notionally a deregulated fee structure. What's most at stake in deregulation for Pyne is his political reputation. The policy details of the legislation are secondary to their status as tokens of his personal influence and effectiveness as a player in the Liberal Party, which is the milieu, of course, to which his future is tied, whether they're in government or not. So proposing an untested and maximalist deregulation package last May functioned to cement the picture of Pyne's daring, his ideological commitment and his ambition, and it certainly succeeded in thrusting him to the centre of national politics. Now though, getting any version of deregulation through, even if it ends up increasing the deficit, will be a major victory for Pyne, which he'll be able to parlay into increased political advantage within the Liberals. So I don't think we should look on Pyne first and foremost as a protagonist in some grand neoliberal crusade against the Australian welfare state. The deregulation debate certainly has some of those characteristics, but the description of it that I've just offered misses, I think, the fact that what really interests Pyne isn't so much the actual ideological content of his policies as their political utility to him within the Liberals. So Pyne is just obviously mainly not an ideologue. He's mainly an opportunist whose aim is to maximise his power and standing within his own party. So deregulation, if you forgive me, I'm going to put this quite crudely, I think it's entirely appropriate. Deregulation should be understood as part of a pissing competition within the Liberal Party. And it's aimed not at doing what makes sense electorally, financially, and certainly not socially, but at doing what will advance Pyne's prospects within the Liberals themselves. So a similar logic holds within the ALP. It's expedient to oppose deregulation now, because doing so is seen to have electoral traction. That, of course, will change, as it always does, when Labor returns to government. And we certainly can't expect that the ALP's current resistance to the marketisation of higher education will last. As with Pyne, the issue has been instrumentalised for short-term political advantage, and it's simply not the case that opposition to the further marketisation of universities represents the unique horizon of the ALP's policy position. Far from it. Finally, and I'll end on this in 3 minutes, something similar is also true for Vice-Chancellors, particularly the ones from the Group of 8, the organisation of the country's oldest and most insufferably entitled universities. Group of 8 VCs have seized on deregulation as their chance to escape the age-old penury of their institutions. They've ignored the serious modelling that's been done on the consequences of these measures for Australian society. They've mostly withheld from the public vital information on the fees they're intending to charge and the scholarships they think they can fund. And they've continued to profess their on-paper commitment to principles of equity and fairness while systematically undermining them in practice. Like the major parties then, they've used the wider social and ethical questions of deregulation as instruments for the competitive advancement of their own institutions and, of course, for their own vice-chancellors' already sky-high salaries. And they've done this at the expense of students, of the public, and of a just society. Collectively, they've shown that when they're not the very agents of the rampaging neoliberal enclosure of knowledge that's running wild in our society, when they're not its very agents, they're congenitally unwilling or unable to raise even a squeak of protest against it. VC's market tunnel vision, their opportunism, their compliance to Canberra, their short-termism, all these are simply monumental. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, the heads of financial regulators, hospitals or fire brigades welcoming the effective withdrawal of state funding with the alacrity that Group of 8 VCs have shown. Defending equitable higher education should be about winning support in a determined and extended public campaign. This has never even been tried. All we hear from the VCs, with the honourable exception of Stephen Parker, is that demands for increased tertiary funding always come up against the brick wall of taxpayer indifference and are doomed from the start. Why has that become an article of faith among VCs, we might ask? And I think the answer is that it's the evidence of some very nasty class prejudice. And the subtext isn't hard to hear. What the VCs are really saying is something like this. They're saying we, the enlightened and educated elite, of course we understand the importance of universities. Even politicians actually understand it. But those bogans in the swinging seats, they don't. They're too stupid. They're too venal. There's nothing anyone can do about that. And we VCs, we can't be blamed if the mass of people's inability to appreciate their own interests lets us feather our own nests a bit deeper. So the most dangerous aspect, though, and I really will end on this now, the most dangerous aspect of VC's position lies not in its consequences for higher education, intolerable though those are. Instead, it lies in its implications for the rest of the government's funding priorities. So in offering up universities as the targets of supposed expenditure reduction, VCs are effectively endorsing the existing budgetary priorities of the federal government. The deployment in the Middle East recently escalated, the war on refugees, tax breaks to middle and corporate Australia, and subsidies for polluters, calculated by the Australian Conservation Foundation as worth a mere $7 billion. All these, it seems, in VC's view, are better uses of taxpayers' dollars than the goal of fostering high levels of educational achievement in society. And it seems to me that this deeply retrograde set of priorities is the single most important reason for which deregulation must be both fought and defeated. Thanks.